Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Centre for Geopolitics. My name is Dr. Hugo Bromley. I'm a research associate here at the Centre, where we are increasingly considering the question and the history of the UK Union, working towards what we hope will be a significant project on its applied history. We want to learn more and explore the questions of how the different composite nations evolved into our current UK Union. What are the challenges that we face, and what can its history tell us about where the Union is going to go next? In pursuit of the answers to some of these questions, we are delighted to be joined by Professor Murray Pittock. Professor Pittock is the Bradley Professor of Literature at the University of Glasgow and Pro-Vice Principal at the university. He was previously Professor of Scottish and Romantic Literature at the University of Manchester, and before that held posts at Edinburgh, Oxford, Aberdeen, and Strathclyde universities. His research covers a huge sweep across the European and global impact of Robert Burns, studies of Culloden, the Scottish Enlightenment, and Jacobitism. But he's here today to talk about his outstanding new book, Scotland, the Global History, a copy of which I have here, and I would urge all to read, because it really is an astonishingly sweeping work that covers so many questions of such relevance to today. Specifically, I'll be speaking today about the Acts of Union and their effect on the British composite monarchy, Scotland and the Union during the British Empire, and then in the post-imperial period. A couple of housekeeping notes before we start. The talk will go on for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat, or rather in the Q&A function, forgive me, and I will read them out to Professor Pittock during the Q&A. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Hugo, and it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you. I hope that everybody can hear me and that the volume on this on the interface is correct. But perhaps you could let Hugo know if you can't, but I'm trusting that you can. I'm going to talk today, as has been indicated, not about the global history per se. That could take us in many directions, but the context of the global history of Scotland in the nature of the changing union. And this is going to be effectively a tour d'horizon of Scotland in union and unions between the 16th century and the present. And of course, that takes into view quite a lot of controversial as well as quite a lot of different material. I'm going to start here with what you might call the Forgotten Union, which is the 1558 composite monarchy union between France and Scotland. This on the right, I think, is a Scottish 5-shilling piece, showing on the left a medal of the union, showing on the Scottish lion rampant and the fleur-de-lis of France on the Scottish coin. These are the coins and medals of the very short-lived composite monarchy union between Scotland and France in 1558 to 60. Short it may have been, but it has an influence. It had a long-standing influence both on Scottish and English constitutional memory, because particularly it was a Catholic alternative and continued to be viewed as a potential Catholic alternative or threat into the 18th century, and indeed influenced some of the political decision-making as far on as that. Here is familiar, I think, to many of you, the set of trial flags, which eventually became the first variant of the Union flag, to indicate the regnal union, the composite monarchical union, not the political union, between Scotland and England in 1603. I think they sum up, in so many ways, the history of the union. There are ones in which, as in the top right, in which Scotland is almost predominant, to ones such as the one on the bottom left, when it's almost extinguished. And indeed, the lower one in the center is one of perfect equality. So the whole range is covered here, from Scottish dominance to Scottish disappearance in the potential Union flags. What we're talking about in this stage, the first stage of union, 1603 to 1707, is a regnal union, which is a composite monarchy. A composite monarchy like, for example, Poland, Lithuania, like the two kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, like the composite Iberian monarchy of the 17th century, and perhaps even one might go so far as to say the Holy Roman Empire itself as the largest and most unruly composite monarchy of all. So a composite monarchy, not a political. James VI and first was initially keen to uniting within Scotland a single kingdom of Great Britain, with both of the parts of that kingdom alike sharing in the benefits of settling Ireland with British Protestants. The Scottish settlement of the northeast of Ireland, of course, which we still have the legacy of, began at scale during his reign, but the British Union itself was stillborn. It was stillborn principally in the first decade of the 17th century because of England. English legislators wanted none of it. And one of the interesting things, which is covered nicely by Sir John Baker in the reinvention of Magna Carta, is that Magna Carta, till then, since the 15th century, almost a dead duck, was revived as a challenge to the king, and a challenge that the incorporation of Scotland with what was seen to be its alien political traditions was inconsistent with the rights of the English subject under Magna Carta and would threaten English jurisdiction. And the judges were adamant that the name Great Britain could not be used for legal purposes for the same reason, because of the status and continuity of English law and what were viewed, and of course, very clearly declared by Parliament in 1628 and many times later, as the rights that it had hard won from the Crown. So there was a lot of suspicion of the Crown's pushing a closer union. In Scotland itself, there perhaps wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm for this closer union, even at the time. Scotland remained an independent state, and I can't really cover, though it's very pertinent to the union discussions, the whole history of the covenants and the wars of the 17th century, but they were part of Scotland's remaining independent state and the challenges and difficulties of that within the Stuart polity. But as with most junior partners in composite monarchies, their sovereignty was compromised to some degree. Of course, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was partly about preserving the elements of the compromised sovereignty of some of the states of the Holy Roman Empire from being overridden by Austrian power, Habsburg power in particular. But all composite monarchies to some extent face this problem, that junior partners tended to be pushed to one side. But in particular, Scotland suffered from a special problem, which that in Scottish tradition, the Crown had total control over all, not just symbolic, but total control over all diplomatic appointments. And that led to a gradual and accidental suppression of Scottish foreign policy, masked to an extent by the Crown, King James appointing Scots to positions of effectively being British diplomats, officially English diplomats, unofficially British diplomats, but in any event, separate Scottish diplomats were not appointed because the Crown was making those diplomatic appointments from London. And as a result, Scotland's ability to project foreign policy and its own diplomatic relations waned from the 1620s onwards. This was a very important part of the failure of the composite monarchy, though it's one that's not particularly dwelt on. It was part of Scotland's unsuccessful projection overseas, because Scotland as a polity wanted to be a mercantile imperial power in the 17th century. It made efforts to do so under royal patronage in Nova Scotia in the 1620s, which was effectively signed away by an agreement to the surrender of Port Royal on the French terms by Charles I in 1631. Scotland made an effort to get involved in trading in Africa through the Guinea Company in the 1630s, gold rather than enslaved persons at this point, but lost their major trading vessel to a Portuguese attack. They got involved again in New Jersey in the 1680s, and of course, most famously perhaps in Darien in the 1690s. In most of these, they were restricted not only by their inability to project their own diplomatic views, and also, it must be said, their own military power, but also restrained by English foreign policy imperatives, because Scottish foreign policy goals often crossed over English foreign policy imperatives, and the Navigation Acts, which effectively reserved trading rights in the empire to English-dominated crews. And there were many ways the Scots tried to get around that. But fundamentally, the Navigation Acts, first introduced in 1651, that went through 4 iterations, kept the Scots from trading with the British Empire, except for a short period of, should be James VII and II, a short-lived attempt to support Scottish enterprise by James VII and II. Scotland was very sensitive to its status. In 1630, the Scottish Privy Council commanded that the use of the Great Britain in treaties be avoided, and the British Crown should start itself England and Scotland and Ireland, Scotland, England, France, and Ireland, to take in the claims of the Crown that were only finally extinguished in 1806. The Commonwealth, even under the Commonwealth, when Scotland was effectively united with a wider English-dominated polity in the 1650s, it was the Commonwealth formerly of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Scotland also, again, partly because of its lack of diplomatic representation, suffered from being seen as a Dutch false flag operation. And this was not helped by the fact that it contributed large numbers of officers to Northern European naval powers, to the Dutch VOC, and also to Denmark, Norway. So Scotland in the 17th century lacked the force to protect commerce. It lacked a powerful company state like the East India Company or the VOC. It lacked the diplomacy to sustain its trading relationships. It also had internal divisions and a worsening 17th century climate, and economic crisis was as a consequence created for the Scottish state. The Union of 1707 was designed in a period of economic weakness to ensure that Scotland came into line with the Act of Settlement, which had rejected any restoration of the Stuarts after the death of Queen Anne, and indeed settled the succession on Sophia of Hanover and her descendants. The Hanoverian succession was rejected by the Scots under the Act of Security, and the Act to End Peace and War reserved to Scotland the right to make war independent of England. These acts in 1702 and 04 were seen as a provocation to the English Parliament, and the Alien Act in 1705 was a retributive measure designed to note that Scots should be excluded or treated as aliens the minute they crossed the border into England, and excluded from any of the trading rights and privileges they might otherwise have enjoyed, unless they agreed to nominate commissioners for a parliamentary union. The parliamentary union was designed to drive Scotland away from any kind of sympathies with France and the Stuarts, and also with the Netherlands, because there'd been a live discussion which continued in the early 18th century up to the union itself, that Scotland could form one of the United Provinces. That was a proposal made by Zeeland in 1677, for example. When the commissioners were appointed, the Presbyterian, they're appointed by the Crown, of course, the Presbyterian elite were heavily overrepresented, with only a token Jacobite presence, though the Jacobites at that stage are certainly have majority support in Scotland. Supporters of union from the elite saw it as the only way to guarantee access to the imperial markets that Scotland was too weak to secure for itself. And in that sense, it's really important to understand that the union was fundamentally an instrumentalist measure in Scottish eyes, not a measure of political merger or union. It's an instrumentalist measure to gain access to imperial markets, which enterprising Scots are frustrated for being excluded. But the union itself becomes almost immediately is a very complicated document in its own right, because although it supersedes the composite monarchy by creating what appears to be a unitary state, it actually retains indeterminate elements, which is why it remains controversial, of both the composite monarchy and the unitary state. And that's partly because, in fact, centrally because its context, the constitutional context in which it was developed, predates the creation of the doctrine of the Crown in Parliament, which was developed in association with the 1719 Irish Declaratory Act, designed to subordinate the Irish Parliament. And this leads to the clauses of the Union and Treaty and Acts reflecting parliamentary and Crown rights in their different forms. So Article 2 enforces the Act of Settlement on Scotland. Articles 4, 6, and 7 address freedom of trade, particularly aimed at overseas markets, and use the term a customs union, which incidentally Westminster returned to in the internal the preliminaries to the Internal Markets Act of 2021 drafting to claim the IMA was restoring the customs union as it existed in 1707. And other articles invoke Westminster parliamentary sovereignty over tax and the standardization of the currency and weights and measures, though in fact our weights and measures were not standardized until 1826, following the 1824 Weights and Measures Act. However, there is a countervailing narrative in the Union documentation. For example, sometimes one which is almost contradictory or potentially contradictory, leaves a lot of room for debate. Article 18 and 19, for example, preserving Scots law but leaving its regulation to the European Parliament, but more centrally the survival of a Scottish kingdom. Despite the fact that there is one kingdom, Great Britain, under Article 1, the Great Seal of Scotland is to be retained under Article 24 as a Great Seal for rights confined within that kingdom, meaning Scotland, which continued in respects of officers, grants, commissions, and private rights, that is Scots law, and the Presbyterian Kirk. So the Union finds itself talking both about that part of the United Kingdom now called Scotland, the United Kingdoms, which it talks about at other points, and the Kingdom of Scotland, which continues to subsist in respect of religious, legal, official, and institutional rights as a separate jurisdiction. So this distinction between Crown and parliamentary rights subsists in the Union document itself. And it's interesting to note in the Irish context, because the Declaratory Act was to be very important for the language of the patriotic Irish parliaments later in the 18th century, was that actually also there are a set of worth attention in the Union context of 1689 acts of the Irish Parliament passed under James II in exile, which also made sovereigntist claims. So the Stuarts are very strongly associated with sovereigntist claims of the Irish Parliament and later of the Scottish Parliament. However, and they opposed the Union for that reason. However, the Union becomes what it is, and I think is still under debate, in 1707 without perfectly articulating the late adoption of the Crown and Parliament, and indeed uses the plural term United Kingdom, which only gradually consolidate into United Kingdom as it's used actually after the 1801 union with Ireland. But interestingly, you can trace the plural usage of United States in the same way, becoming only majority used as a singular in a majority of instances from the 1870s, some 10 years after the Civil War. So there's an interesting journey there, which is not parallel in historical terms, but parallel in terms of nomenclature between plural and singular usages of United Kingdom and state. Now, the Union therefore conceives of a United Kingdom over which parliamentary rights are sovereign, while the Crown's own rights and the patronage and protection of private right are alike preserved in the Kingdom of Scotland itself. The clauses that describe these things tend to use language such as forever when they're talking about Crown right, and not to do so when they're talking about parliamentary right. And the Crown right, of course, includes jurisdiction because it includes the Crown patronized or founded institutions of the Faculty of Advocates, 1532, and the Society of Writers to His Majesty's Signet, 1594, as well as the boroughs, church, schools, and universities. It is, therefore, a composite monarchy. And I think one of the most piquant moments, having been part of the commentariat in that very sad 2 weeks after the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth at Balmoral in September this year, is that when commentators from London looked at some of the ceremonies that were going on in Scotland, which were carried on by the royal household with the announcement of their Lord Lion outside Parliament House and so forth, the royal household in Scotland, that is, they actually couldn't understand them. But the separate royal household in Scotland and the separate royal appointment system and the separate protocols that attended Operation Unicorn part of the obsequies of Her Majesty the Queen were very much part of the legacy of Crown right under the 1707 Union. Now, under the Union, in the end, Scotland as a polity and many of the Scottish elite achieved a great many of their goals, because a lot of what lay behind the force that Scotland was able to project in the world was derived from the overproduction of educated at this stage men, with higher education costing roughly 10% of what it did at Oxford and Cambridge at the Scottish universities, and the inability of the country to offer scope for their ambition. The legacy of the impossibility of expanding territorially because of a disproportionately powerful neighbour. The Scottish border, with the exception of 5 square kilometres near the Solway, with England and Berwick, is exactly the same as it was in 1237 at the quitclaim, when the quitclaim of York was agreed between Henry III and Alexander II. The Scottish economy, which stood in need of a proactive trade policy because it lacked bullion and required foreign currency to maintain monetary circulation, and that is, of course, why Scotland was associated with the development of fiat currency in the person of John Law in the 1720s, who was always keen to expand the money supply. And Scotland's limited exports, as opposed to their complex and often luxurious requirements for imports, which led to a desire on Scotland and Scots' part to actually control, as they often did, for example, from Veer in the Netherlands and from Bergen in Norway, to control the imports from other countries into Scotland through Scottish merchant houses, and therefore to benefit from both the import and export sides of Scottish trade. Now, this was the continental model which the empire overturned, but overturned very gradually, and actually partly at the initiative of that great statesman, I thought I'd say that provocatively, Sir Robert Walpole, who decided that one of the key ways of detaching Scots from Jacobitism was to encourage their presence in the East India Company. And here I'll just take very brief excursus into one classic example. John Drummond, the son of George Drummond of Blair Drummond and Elizabeth, daughter of Sir Gilbert Ramsay, a classic member of the Scottish upper classes, but not the high nobility, went to Amsterdam, as many Scots did, to develop a mercantile career in 1693, but shortly afterwards became an agent of the English government before the Union. His reward was to become one of the conduits of patronage to the EIC, which Walpole appointed him, was appointed as the director of the EIC in 1722. And but 9 years later, he was also appointed British government commissioner at Antwerp. And therefore, Drummond utilized his low country connections, being also involved in the VOC coffee trade, the Dutch East India Company, to pass intelligence about the VOC back to the EIC and to the British government, as well as to nominate likely Jacobites who were detachable from the movement, the kind of grey zone elite of the People's Republic of China in modern Chinese parlance, detachable with the right kind of presence, the right kind of friendliness, the right kind of patronage for EIC preferment. And that was the route that Walpole took. It became, of course, the foundation of the Scottish imperial route, but there were many survivals, including the Scottish mercantile communities in France, and Scots didn't lose their right to French citizenship finally until 1904, the Scots colleges in the continent, and the preservation of a separate Scottish Catholic province, which was restored 37 years after the hierarchy in England in 1887, the Scottish regiments in the French service, and the Edinburgh Regiment in the Spanish service, and the continuation of Scottish trading arrangements, such as the Staple of Veer, which in fact declared its neutrality in 1780 after the Dutch went to war with the British Empire during the American War of Independence, though it did lead to the Scots Brigade in the Dutch service being fully incorporated into the Dutch army, so there wouldn't be a conflict of interest. And that title, the title of conservator of the Scots Staple at Veer, has maintained its at least ceremonial form in one way or another until the modern era. But of course, much more familiar is the picture of the imperial Scot from the 19th century. These are, of course, two Punch cartoons. Old Scotsman to his son, who's just returned from a business trip to London. "Well, laddie, and what do you think of the English now?" "Son, I didn't have much of a chance to study them. You see, only had to do with the heeds of departments. So Scots run the empire, that kind of trope. But on the other side, a different sort of cartoon, and that's the petition against 104,000 Scots again it's on regnal names and regnal numerals. So we're Queen Elizabeth in Scotland, Queen Elizabeth II in England. Scots retained a very strong symbolic desire to assert their own identity within the Union. One of the most remarkable things is, for those that this will be a familiar sight perhaps, on the right, the Wallace Monument, unveiled in 1869. Less familiar perhaps is the rejected design actually adopted at a meeting in Stirling by the relevant committee, which was then subsequently conveniently held to be in Quarret, the design of Sir Noel Peyton, for the lion subduing the dragon. And that extremely provocative and aggressive monument on the left-hand side is effectively the runner-up to what the Wallace Monument became. So it's in 19th century Scotland, you're looking at rather a bifurcation of a sometimes very aggressive and definitive attraction to the national past, and also full participation in the British Empire. But one of the things to remember about full participation in that empire is that Scots organized themselves through St Andrews societies, Caledonian societies, later Barnes clubs, into organizations abroad, which effectively existed to prefer Scots into imperial jobs, and that this was entirely tolerated by the British Empire. The separate definition of Scottish nationality within the British Empire, here, for example, seen in the Scottish Pavilion in the 1938 Empire Exhibition's list of national pavilions, was very much part of the British imperial idea and process. And the preservation of Scottish identity and Scottish symbolism in the British Empire was a really important part of the Scottish consent for the British Empire, because it allowed the expression of aggressive, even if not quite Sir Noel Peyton aggressive, statements of national selfhood to an internal audience, combined with the presence of national identity globally through the widespread national associations and St Andrews societies, Burns clubs, and the like. So I think without people noticing it immediately, certainly not in the wider UK, a really new narrative of Great Britain emerged between 1938 and 1951, one which was essentially introspective, what you might call today the standalone narrative of 1940, rather than outward-looking. So these are the Festival of Britain posters and symbol. The imperial, although the empire is virtually intact in 1951, the imperial iconography is entirely gone. We've moved from the Scottish Pavilion to the land and the people. Britain, not as a multiple, an international idea where you could be Canadian and British, New Zealand and British, and Scottish and British, but Britain is the land and the people, a cohesive singular nation, perhaps with diverse cultures, but fundamentally a seamless whole, one of whose symbols is a common language. For example, Anclachan, the Scots Gaelic village, which was a favorite of George VI, actually, at the 1938 Empire Exhibition, and had first appeared in the 1911 exhibition, was nowhere to be seen in the Festival of Britain, nor was any equivalent, and nor was any Gaelic. And then no subtitling was offered for the Welsh Folk Music Museum either. Rather, the Festival of Britain initiated a vision following the arrival of Empire Windrush with 492 West Indian passengers in June 1948 of an internal diversity based around the empire rather than an internal diversity based around nationalities within Britain. In other words, the singleness of Britain was that the empire had come home. The red, white, and blue star of the festival, the national self, replaced the multiple flags of empire and the traditional historical pageantry of the old empire exhibitions. For example, the Saltire had been at the center of one of the 1924 posters even for the Wembley exhibition. But it was these were all marginalized, and that was particularly critical in the case of Scotland, because it was critical to Scottish understanding of the Union. And the 1951 festival closed with a singing of Jerusalem, to be built, of course, in England's green and pleasant land. Now, this didn't entirely go unnoticed in Scotland. It's part of the development of the Scotland we see today, albeit that was a slow burn process. First of all, there was the challenge to Queen Elizabeth's regnal titles in 1953, McCormack versus the Lord Advocate, which led to McCormack losing, except on one count, which is Lord Cooper, who was a former Unionist MP, and the Lord President, the senior judge in Scotland, upheld one of the three counts, and that was the count of sovereignty, and noted in his 1953 judgment, the principle of the unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctly English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. I have difficulty in seeing why it should have been supposed the Parliament of Great Britain must inherit all the peculiar characteristics of the English Parliament, but none of the Scottish Parliament, as if all that happened in 1707 was that Scottish representatives remitted to the Parliament of England. That was not what was done. And here you see some of the wiggle room of which the Union has always been capable. And this kind of awareness, present in the 1950s, there's Flag in the Wind is a reference to McCormack's own 1955 book, which warned about a new Britishness based entirely or almost entirely on London, which you could see developing in the future. Of an increasingly insular view, as far as Scots saw it, in Britain elsewhere. Britain, a new central story of Britain at one and alone, a place where the term postcode lottery is first used by the 45-50 Labour government, all the same all over, with a contramundum, sovereign solitude, combined with the visible signs of imperial decline, the major rush to decolonization that precipitated in 1967-8, within a few weeks, major devaluation, the foreign policy retreat west of Suez, the collapse of British power in Aden and the flight from there on St. Andrew's Day, 1967, and the end of the Mediterranean fleet in the middle of 1967. Really critical moment in British history, but a critical moment in Scottish history too. And the heirs of Disraeli, I'm not sure how many people think of Harold Wilson and Ed Miliband as the heirs of Disraeli, but I like to, were wrong in one particular, which is that the one nation in front of which, rather stylized way, Lord Wilson of Rievaulx and Ed Miliband are standing, was actually, in Disraeli's view, England, very much England, but it is no longer England. The desire for the United Kingdom to be all the same is fundamentally a counter-union desire. And it was a desire which was capitalized on in the context of the UK's loss of status and Scotland's increasing invisibility, both as excluded from the empire and excluded from notions of a multicultural Britain, in Winnie Ewing's campaign for the Hamilton by-election in November 1967, where after her surprising victory, this is one of her election posters, pretty obviously sitting on top of a globe, she said, stop the world, Scotland wants to get on. It was a determination in this very difficult period to reactivate. And one of the reasons that it was not the Liberal Party who benefited, as they had done, for example, at Orpington in 1962, from discontent with the major political parties, but a major victory for the Scottish National Party, which indeed changed UK politics arguably forever, or certainly up to the present, which came in the heart of a calendar of defeats, declines, withdrawals, including President de Gaulle's second veto of UK EEC membership on 27th November 1967. I commend anybody to read that de Gaulle speech, because he could have made it 50 years later. It's a remarkably prescient piece of work by the President of the Fifth Republic. So from the Scottish point of view, the Union was an instrumental agreement, and the thing it had meant to secure imperial trade was no longer there. And at the same time, Scotland was much less visible in the United Kingdom than it had been. And that created a degree of tension around the Union. and a degree of misunderstanding of what the Union was, probably Westminster, which went far beyond what people thought of as simply the tidying up arrangements. You'll sometimes read, for example, that in 1955 was the last time the Tories had a majority of seats in Scotland. That's not the case. They never had a majority of seats in Scotland. In 1955, the Scottish Unionists had a majority of seats in Scotland. And the Unionists fought every election in Scotland, general election in Scotland, as Unionists between 1911 and 1965, when they were 1966, when they were amalgamated. The amalgamation was not complete fully until the 1970 general election, into the Conservative Party to become the Conservative Unionist Party in Scotland. But they never achieved the same resonance as the Scottish Unionists had as a particular Unionist party in Scotland, dedicated to upholding both Scottish patriotism and the Union, the party of, for example, John Buchan. Because by 1990, 56% of Conservative supporters in Scotland thought the party was mainly an English party with little relevance to the country they were in. And that's a critical point. There might be lots of reasons for them to vote for them nonetheless. That's a critical point about Conservative loss of support in Scotland, that the Conservatives weren't a tidy replacement for the Scottish Unionists. They weren't the Scottish Unionists. And they've had to deal with that impact of that all the way from the mid-1960s onwards. And meanwhile, both Northern Ireland, in the shape of the Troubles in 1969, and Scotland, in the shape of the campaigns for self-government, the Kilbrandon Commission's report, the high vote for the Scottish National Party, the narrow majority, but not a winning majority under the terms of the Cunningham Amendment governing the 40% of the electorate who needed to vote for it in Scotland, all occupied the 1970s. And in the 1980s, you get a degree of surrogate international nationalism in Scotland. For example, the big ceremonies over the renaming of George Square as Place as Nelson Mandela Place in Glasgow in 1986, and the development from 1989 onwards of the Scottish Constitutional Convention following the claim of right for Scotland. This is a very interesting document. It is the document signed by a large number of members of Parliament. None of them are Scottish National Party members of Parliament. All of them are Labour and Liberal Democrat members of Parliament, and all of them assert the right of the sovereign people to determine the government best suited to their needs. So there's a great deal of sovereigntist language in the claim of right, and it's not a sovereigntist language that the leaders, or indeed the members, with some exceptions of either of these political parties, would now sign up to. But in that era, in the Thatcherite era, they did. And it's very interesting to compare the claim of right for Scotland in 1988 and the language used by the Labour Party at that time about Scottish sovereignty with the language used today. Developments, of course, did not stop there, and some of these are more familiar than others, but I would point to the Strathclyde water referendum, when the Strathclyde region, Scotland's largest unit of local government at that time, covering about 2.5 million people, organized its own referendum against the possibility of the privatization of Scottish water, the result of which, with more than 95% of people on a significant turnout voting to keep water in public hands, being the fundamental reason why the privatization of water was not pursued in Scotland by the Conservative government, why water remains in public hands today. That was followed after the major defeat of the Conservatives in 1997 by the Scotland Act of 1998, where instead of the 1970s legislation, which decided what would be devolved to Scotland, Donald Dewar, who was a very sharp man and very well versed in parliamentary history, instead went all the way back to Gladstone's secret memorandum number 3 of 1885 in framing the first Irish Home Rule Bill and stipulating reserved rather than devolved powers. And it was appeared to be much cleaner than the 1970s legislation, although the UK government has recently, by moving to legislate in devolved or open the possibility of legislating in devolved areas, muddied the waters again. Partly because the Scottish Parliament proved to be somewhat other than Lord Robertson's claim that it would kill nationalism stone dead. It in fact led, first of all, to an SNP official opposition, then to an SNP government, then to an SNP majority government in a proportional system in 2011, and then to the referendum. Briefly, this is just for familiarity, this is the makeup of the Scottish referendum vote by demographic in 2014. And as you can see, over 65s are pretty unlikely to have supported independence, but that a large number in all other groups did, with particular highs among 16 to 17-year-olds, and interestingly among 25 to 34-year-olds as well. So there's a strong demographic imprint, rather like the Brexit one in reverse, on the Scottish yes vote in 2014. But one of the reasons that it hasn't translated cleanly into it's a heightened yes vote, but it hasn't translated cleanly to a much heightened yes vote, has been the makeup of the Scottish, obviously Scotland voted, all its 32 local authority areas voted to remain in the European Union, but the Scottish Brexit vote in 2016 were 28% remain and voted no in 2014, 21% remain and voted yes in 2014, 16% leave and voted no in 2014, 14% leave and voted yes in 2014. So while there was a very strong majority, 62-38, to remain in the EU, it didn't cut a lot cleanly along constitutional lines, as probably the governing Scottish National Party would have wished. But what were those constitutional lines? Well, I'll close this lecture by just talking a little bit about what Scots think and what the constitutional position has been. So as long ago as 1999, 46% of Scots answering the Economist's large-scale constitutional poll thought that their parliament would be the most important element in Scotland's governance in 20 years' time, with 31% preferring the European Union and only 8% hoping it would be Westminster. At the same time, there was a gradual move in the wake of the Scotland Act towards judicial findings, which suggested that the doctrines of parliamentary sovereignty on which the British Parliament rested, and now once again seeks very firmly to rest, had actually been changed by the constitutional legislation. And the 1998 Scotland Act points to a divided sovereignty. That's Lord Steen's 2005 judgment and Jack's against the Attorney General, and Lord Hope's insistence as Lord of Appeal in Ordinary and a former Lord President in Scotland that the gradual qualification must be accepted of parliamentary sovereignty, which is no longer, if it ever was, absolute. And once again, you hear the sceptical view of Lord Cooper there from 1953 there in Lord Hope's judgment. And the UK government-sponsored Coleman Commission in 2009 noted in its report, there's much else to the same vein, that the United Kingdom has never been a unitary state, and again reputed the idea of undivided parliamentary sovereignty. But this has come under a lot of pressure. It's come under a lot of pressure in the European context. As long ago as 2011, 41% of the Polish community in Scotland voted for the Scottish National Party at the election in that year. And in 2014, roughly 60% of the Asian community in Scotland voted yes to independence. Through the Internal Market Act, which enabled the British government to bypass the Scottish Parliament and to fund and devolve policy areas directly, even in contradiction to existing Scottish government priorities, and to undermine devolved policy. And this has led to a particularly divided situation in Scotland. In 2021 election in Scotland, 49% of the constituency vote and just over 50% of the list vote went to pro-independence parties. But also what's been noticeable, this was taken earlier this year, or sorry, late last year, is that declining support for the monarchy, 55% not proud of the Queen, compared to 17% in England, 15% were compared to 50% south of the border. And that was the first time that polling had shown an impact on views of the monarchy in Scotland, partly as an ancillary to views on the rest of the constitution. And likewise, much more recent polling, and this is from the last couple of months, suggests that 48% trust Holyrood, and 15% trust Westminster in Scottish politics. There is a really divided national story and national outlook in the context of how you interpret the union. And the question of how that union is interpreted is really a question of the relationship of the United Kingdom with a larger union, which it has withdrawn from, and which has further problematized the nature of the Anglo-Scottish Union, not only because it's not been as Dean Aitchison might have hoped, a replacement for the British Empire and Commonwealth, but also because the consensus in British politics on both sides of the House so strongly suggests that it needs Brexit needs to be supported and to be made to work. Not, I think, an assertion which is easily sustained by anything which might be called evidence-led policy. But the nature of the kind of evidence adduced, and this is in the context of wishful thinking about the behaviour of Ireland during the Brexit negotiations, is itself full of wishful thinking. And I think I just want to quote there one of many, Lord Digby Jones, as a former minister of the British government and Director General of the CBI, noting in 2019 that Ireland will need to fall in line because it does 90% of its trade with the UK. The data at that point being that Ireland did 11% of its trade in goods with the UK and 6% in services. That is some of the kind of world of data or its absence which we've learnt to live with over the last few years. But it also has an impact on the way in which concentric unions are understood in the different parts of this increasingly fragmented United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. If you just, yes, fantastic. Okay, so we have some questions come in already and more I'm sure will flow through. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to hold off for now. And we begin with a question from David Hood of the Edinburgh Institute, who asks, given the forthcoming ruling from the UK Supreme Court relating to the rights of the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum, how can, and given that it's likely to rule against the Scottish Parliament, I think his assumption there is correct, how can this deadlock be satisfactorily resolved to balance these union-related issues to Scotland's own democratic rights?
I think it would not be fair not to say that there does not exist a significant risk that it won't be resolved, and that there will simply be an attempt to stonewall it continually, and that attempt may very well continue until there is a significant break up or down from the current 50-50 split in Scotland.
Okay, we'll move to a question from Professor Brendan Sims, who is the director here at the Centre for Geopolitics, who asks that it's often said that the challenge of war helped to drive England and Scotland together originally and indeed in later stages. What effect do you think the war on Ukraine and the Russian threat more widely will have on the Union?
So I think one of the interesting features of the last year has been the foundation of the Scottish Council for Global Affairs, which is actually supported by both the Scottish government and by the MOD, a very unusual cross-border entity in that respect, which has been looking particularly at Arctic security. And the Scottish government are very interested in engaging naturally with international bodies that don't require statehood for membership, of which there are more than one might think, including, technically speaking, the Nordic Council. But they've been very engaged in the Arctic, and that has been principally so far on climate shifts in the Arctic and on the strategy for preservation of the Arctic. But it looks to increasingly may start to focus on the issues which are being raised about Arctic security by the new Scottish Council for Global Affairs. So I think we're in a transition period here, and we may expect more significant thinking about defence to come out in the next year or two. On the other hand, a lot of the Scottish electorate, even those who support an independent Scotland, kind of support an independent Scotland. Someone will jump on my head here, but in my view, and the evidence suggests this, support independent Scotland because they kind of like to recreate an idealized Britain north of the Tweed, not because they've thought about Scotland as a state actor with international alliances beyond, for example, the EU, and those alliances will involve alliances on policy and security. And indeed, the pivotal role of the potentially pivotal role of Scotland as an Arctic state in a future independent world where the Arctic is melting and where Russian access to the Arctic is much more unfettered than it is at present, is a significant one that deserves attention.
Okay, that's fascinating. We've got some questions coming in, but I'm just going to ask something of my own, which is, in your book, you talk about economic development in manufacturing and house building as something that the SNP try to claim, but is in fact very British in its nature. And indeed, something you link to that is radicalism and working class movements against certain kinds of control in the late 19th and early 20th century. I was listening to your presentation and the slide on potential exports, and you talk about wool and raw fish. Of course, after Union, the Scottish linen industry expands massively, driven primarily by access to the English market down south of the border, though there's also an Atlantic dimension and a European dimension. I was wondering if you could talk about the role of manufacturing and economic development in Union, and whether that represents a path alongside other kinds of reforms to the Union towards a more harmonious relationship between England and Scotland.
So that's a big question. I think that the key driver of Scottish convergence with the rest of the UK on GDP per capita, certainly, and I think Julian Hoppett's The Dreadful Monster and Its Poor Relations is really good on this, is actually, those Scottish historians are increasingly on top of it as well, the repatriation of funds from the Caribbean and from India. That invested domestically in Scotland drives a huge shift in Scottish business and profitability from 1780 to 1830-40. It's accompanied with quite a lot of technical innovation as well, but I'm not sure that that's actually a repeatable option. You've seen the announcement this week by the Prime Minister that more British frigates are going to be built in the Clyde, or that's kind of very standard. It's been standard, stop the Nats language since the 1970s. We'll build warships on the Clyde. And ultimately, it's not about the revivification of manufacturing industry. I think the question is the critics of the Union fundamentally think that the UK can't reform itself. It can neither actually devolve power within England, nor can it actually have multiple centers of power, because it just doesn't know how. That's just not how it's set up to have multiple centers of power. It's not in the politico-legal feng shui of being British to have multiple centers of power, whatever one might say about leveling up. And so that ultimately it'll be material which represents expenditure, but expenditure based on orders financed and delivered elsewhere, or inward investment which depends on the absence of central decision-making capacity, R&D capacity, HR and sea corridor capacity. So I think that there isn't a route there, actually. I think that's what people, that's the view in Scotland. There isn't a route there, and that this is part of the nature of the UK in its modern manifestation. Not that they don't think that issue doesn't apply in certain parts of England as well.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned English devolution, for which watch this space for more. Okay, we have a question here from Roger Bass, who I think has just sent in his affiliation. Yes, the CEO of Global Standard Money and Settlement. And he asks an interesting question, actually, which is that the UK and France share an interest in deepening engagement, including in the Global South and in Africa. Since 2018, Ireland is an observer in La Francophonie. By the same process, might Scotland lead for the UK in possible new arrangements with France?
So it's very interesting because the French Consulate General in Edinburgh is situated in the Free French House opened by de Gaulle in 1942, and they're very, very conscious of the long-standing connection between the two countries. I certainly think it's possible. I certainly think that also that if you wanted to improve the union settlement, the inclusion of Scotland as a separate entity in some of these bodies is potentially very beneficial. And I mean, that's not that it does. It's not that it doesn't absolutely happen. I have myself been a Scottish representative in the UK-Canada annual discussions, partly because of the politics of the Confederation makes that simpler. But there isn't a reason why Scotland can't participate now. However, there's also a good chance that it might be able to participate in the future. And France is very delicately, but very aware of these issues.
Okay, a question from Andrew Corbett at KCL, who asks, is there a lesson to be learned for Holyrood aspiring to independence about growing foreign and defense policy expertise from the experience of the lack of expertise in the 18th century? I think particularly you're referring to the earlier period there, I might be wrong.
Yes, so I think that puts put your finger on it. There is some degree of foreign policy expertise, and of course Scotland has an increasing number of representatives abroad, though it's still very far short of Quebec and Bavaria. So there's much more than there was 10 or 15 years ago, but it's very much a standing start. And yes, one of the difficulties is that this is one of the most controversial areas, that a lot of the Scottish electorate want Scottish issues to be first and foremost, and don't see inward investment and trade as national questions for Scotland. And that itself is quite, so there's actually more will in Holyrood, in the Scottish government, to push forward with this agenda than there is political willingness to accept it. That's the case with foreign policy. With defense, I think that there is a skills gap to fill, and I think that some of our colleagues in the Scottish Council of Global Affairs are actually going to try and are trying to fill that. And with the Scottish government's blessing, I have to say, because it suits them to have an arm's length body co-funded by themselves and the UK government and co-supported by those two entities who are looking at issues of security in a way which can't be criticised by the unionist parties in Holyrood, and can't be associated purely with Scottish government policy. Okay,
we're going to. It's 6:33 now. We're going to go a little bit earlier because a little bit on because of technical issues. So a couple of final questions. One here from, one moment. Yes. From Bridget Nunes Cooper, who asks, what about the Kelmac ferry disaster when thinking about bringing shipbuilding back to the Clyde? Which is a fun question, but I think, do we have more Wi-Fi issues? We may do. Are you there?
I'm okay. Yes, can you hear me?
So good. It's an interesting question because I think it also speaks to decision-making and decision-making capability in Westminster as opposed to in Holyrood.
Right. So I think, first of all, so I mean, I think the Ferguson Marine is a tale of how not to manage a project, which is to approve a business plan without any outcomes or timetable and leave it on nobody's desk in particular. But I have to say, I think that's not been well handled, no question about it. But I would have to say, I don't always see the UK government doing this particularly well either. I think that the idea of having a business case for your own investments, Honora O'Neill once said a few years ago, I think that House of Lords, that all government spending plans should be fully economically costed for both their costs and their impact. And I think that would be a very nice place to be in. So, I mean, I do think the Scottish government did not do well here, but I don't think it's unique to them.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but there's one final question I would ask, which is that one of the central arguments of your book, and it runs right the way through, is that Scottish participation and Scottish identity in the Union was always bound up in empire to a greater extent than English identity. And I think that's profoundly right.
Yeah.
South of the border, we've had a massive reckoning in the last 20 years with the legacy of empire, and we're continuing to do so. That reckoning is taking place in Scotland also. How do you think those two things intersect? And does there need to be a greater conversation about specifically Scottish participation in empire and its consequences?
So to the last part of the question, I think that's already happening. I think it may not be so visible in England, but I think it's definitely happening in Scotland, and it's moving forward at a rate of knots. So it's moving very quickly. It's actually got rather a different shape than in England, and it doesn't have a culture war attached to it, but it's very much happening. Mm-hmm. So yes, to that, I think the issue for Scotland is that the empire was much more important when it was happening, and it's much less important now it's gone. And that's one of its paradoxes, that actually there isn't nostalgia. There isn't a belief in Scottish greatness. I mean, there's some nostalgia for, international Scots and what they achieved in the past and for the great days of the shipbuilding industry in certain quarters and so on. But there isn't the same kind of feeling that we are an imperial power. There's a real knowledge that we aren't. And I think that's one of the areas where Scottish and English public discourse, albeit that the present government in England is ramping up a particular point of view, it don't altogether meet, because that the view of empire was instrumental. And when it was instrumental, every lever was pulled. And now the instruments aren't there, really nobody cares.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful lecture, wonderful Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I've learned a huge amount, and I hope everyone has too. Before we go, the usual plugs, please follow the Centre for Geopolitics on social media, particularly on Twitter @CamGeopolitics. This panel, like all our panels, will be uploaded to our YouTube page, so you can rewatch it there and also see other panels and other topics. Please also sign up to our mailing list. You can do so via our website, where you'll learn about more events coming along the line. There will be more events on the UK Union as we move into the new year. Thank you, everyone, very much.
Thank you for coming along tonight.